I am joined by the great Roman Tomashoff of Locked On Huskies to talk about the biggest news out of Montlake in the Big Ten, the Washington Huskies landing Desmond Claude from the University of Southern California, a Big Ten transfer addition, joining Wesley Yates, who also transferred from USC to Washington. And Roman, let's start here. We heard that Desmond Claude was interested in UW. It was UW, Gonzaga, Alabama was his top three initially. And I know Tyon Grant-Foster from Grand Canyon was also linked at Washington and Gonzaga, as well as Arizona State. Most of you know this listening, but I also host Locked On Zags. And I remember thinking, I didn't expect that Grant-Foster and Claude would split between Gonzaga and Washington. I thought, somebody else will get in the mix, or one of them will go to the SEC. But here we are. Grant-Foster lands at Gonzaga. At that point, Alabama got LeBaron Philon back in the NBA draft process. And it kind of felt like the seas had cleared for Desmond Claude to end up in Seattle with Washington. What was your initial reaction finding out that Claude is, in fact, going to be a Husky for next season?
Honestly, it was, finally, because it's one of those things where throughout just this transfer portal process, Washington has done a great job of overhauling this roster, which I'm sure we'll get into. But it's one of those things where, you mentioned Tyon Grant-Foster, Cedric Coward is another name, Darian Williams is another name, where throughout this process, every single big-time wing name that came up at any point, it was, oh, hey, Washington's interested. Oh, hey, Washington's going to try to get into the mix here. Was at least, things that I was hearing just here in Seattle. And just getting Desmond Claude is such a fantastic way to round out a roster that I'm really, really impressed with, because he can do so many different things. And, he led USC in points and scoring per game and assists as well last season. So I love to see that, because we just looked at what this Washington roster was last season. And it was just kind of a bunch of guys who, all right, is anybody going to show up alongside Great Osobor? And unfortunately for Danny Sprinkle in his first season, a lot of times the answer was no.
And one thing that stands out to me, kind of looking at Washington's pursuit of wings in the transfer portal, like you mentioned, is kind of what that means for the fit for Claude. Because I know when Claude left Xavier after 2 years with the Musketeers, one of the main things he was looking for was an opportunity to kind of be the primary lead ball handler, playing on the ball. And he got that absolutely at USC. I mean, he was there. He brought the ball up every single time. He was clearly and unquestionably the point guard for Coach Musselman's team, with what would be generally considered good results. I think it's also important to acknowledge he led the Big Ten in turnovers and was one of the top, 10 in the country in turnovers. He turned the ball over a lot because he, hadn't typically played that lead guard role. I think, for USC, and it was a roster of 11 new players. So not all those turnovers were his fault, but that is kind of an area of, skepticism around Claude's game at this point. And you kind of mentioned how they were looking at so many other wings, guys like Grant-Foster and Coward and Williams, who would not have played point guard for UW had they committed. So where do you kind of see Claude then fitting in? Do you think he is coming to UW to kind of be that primary on-ball guy? I know they got some other transfers coming in who've kind of played a similar role, where they were like the lead player, but also the best player on their roster. So kind of where do you think Claude fits role-wise for the Huskies?
So I really do think he's going to end up playing off ball. I'm really impressed with just what Danny Sprinkle was able to do to just integrate players into his, it goes so far beyond Washington, right? You think about what he was at Utah State and what that team was at Montana State as well, and how he was able to get players to fit into what he wants them to do. And it was something that, as this season kind of went downhill, since Washington finished last in the Big Ten, he told us in the media during one of his last couple of games, I need to do a better job of vetting these players through the transfer portal process and making sure that they are going to be good culture fits, not just, good in terms of what they can bring on the floor. So that's one thing that's really important to consider here, because you talk about Quimari Peterson from East Tennessee State, who was the so-called player of the year last year, who averaged 21 points per game last season and did shoot over 40% from long range. But it feels like he's going to be that sort of true point guard mold, since that's what he was asked to do, because behind him, you also have Zoom Diallo, who's coming back for a sophomore season. He was another big-time on-ball guy last year, and he's still starting to, figure some things out, and I expect him to take a big jump forward this year. And plus, you're bringing in a top 50, top 60 recruit in four-star point guard JJ Mandequit, who is just the definition of an old-school on-ball point guard who is a pass-first sort of guy. So you don't need to have Desmond Claude fill that role. You can have him just kind of be a wing slasher, and we know he's going to be a high-level defender as well. So if you can just have him do that, you can take some pressure off of him with some of these other fantastic additions that Danny Sprinkle has brought in around him.
Yeah, and I think one thing that stands out to me too is when you talk about Claude, and I don't want to keep harping on the negatives, but the other negative for Claude fairly clearly is the 3-point shooting. It's just not there. It's never been there. It's never been a part of his game. And I think, like, again, from the putting the Gonzaga goggles on, they desperately needed 3-point shooting and couldn't really afford to take on a player who was going to command so much attention, but who couldn't shoot. But Washington's in a position. I mean, Wesley Yates was a phenomenal shooter last year. And then you mentioned Peterson. He shot 42% from three last year. Like, they got some guys who can really space the floor. And it feels like that sort of mitigates some of that concern with Claude. And again, kind of sticking on Yates specifically, like, these two guys played together last year, and Yates was a guy who, took him a little bit to get going, and obviously he'd already been at UW. He redshirted his entire freshman year, left UW after the coaching change, comes to USC, and then in conference play last year, he was unbelievable. I feel like there's so many people who, even like diehard college basketball fans, who sort of missed this Wesley Yates explosion. He was like 18 points, like almost 50% from three for like a 25 game stretch. Like, he was incredible. And you add him, you add Claude, they're familiar with each other. They've already played together. They both kind of had some of their best work of the season playing off each other. Like, it feels like that combined with a bunch of floor spacers is a pretty dynamic offensive set for Danny Sprinkle. You feeling like, again, even looking at some of the other additions, Bryson Tucker and Lathan Somerville from Rutgers, like, what do you kind of feel like this new look roster, how the pieces are going to fit together for Coach Sprinkle?
Yeah, so one guy who I think is also going to be really important in this is Lipscomb transfer Jacob Ognacevic, where he was the Atlantic Sun player of the year last year, and he also shot 40% from three-point range, where he averaged 20 points and 8 rebounds per game. So you have three guys that are probably going to end up starting in Peterson, Yates, and Ognacevic that all shoot over 40% from deep, which is a great sign. So yeah, it's a little bit easier to take on somebody like Claude, which is one of the reasons that I believe this process took so long, because, I mentioned somebody like Cedric Coward, some of these other guys who were a little bit more just adept at shooting the 3-point ball. But now it's a little bit easier to say, all right, we have all these guys in the rotation. Bryson Tucker is somebody you mentioned who I really like his upside. I know he missed a bunch of games last year with an injury down the stretch. And another guy who I want to mention that I think is going to really, really help this roster out a lot is German. He's going to come in as a true freshman prospect, Hans Steinbach. He's somebody who he's averaging a double-double right now over in the Bundesliga playoffs, and has just been truly fantastic. Because when we look at what Washington's downfall was last season, there are so many different things you can point to. That just wasn't a cohesive team. There was no depth up front, and I think that's one of the big ones that, honestly, I overlooked for different points of last season as, you start to really learn what Big Ten play is. And it's something where having a guy like that who is experienced overseas is going to come in and be a really, really nice backup to Ognacevic, and I think Franck Kepnang, if he's healthy, is going to be the two starters down there, plus having Steinbach, plus Lathan Somerville, who you mentioned, and then Matty Traore, one of the top 2 or 3 players in the nation from the junior college ranks, coming in as well to really anchor a strong front court. That combined with all this backcourt depth that you just went through, this roster has a real opportunity to take a big step forward this season.
Last question for you, and you touched on it perfectly at the end there. There's nowhere to go but up. Like, let's be honest, the only place that they can go in the Big Ten is up for this club. Obviously, it was the first year in the new conference. The travel schedule is the first year of a new coach. Like, I think there was a lot of reasons that you can kind of write off the season and not say like, okay, like, we're already out on Sprinkle or anything. Like, you got to give them a little bit more time, especially with getting all the bearings straight. But what's the optimism level going into this season, knowing that, Coach Sprinkle acknowledged some of the things that didn't go well last year? Now you've added to that depth in the front court. You've brought in a talented transfer portal class. You have some key pieces returning who could step into bigger roles, like Zoom. You mentioned him. How are folks feeling in, early June here, kind of getting ready for this season, knowing, that it didn't go great last year, but there's a lot of potential upside coming into second year for Coach Sprinkle?
Yeah, I think the general public is still a little bit down on UW basketball as a whole, because this team hasn't made the tournament since 2019. So there's a lot of just doubt of like, oh, we want to, see it on the floor first. But you look at the investments that this coaching staff has made in this roster. You touched on the transfer portal class. I fully expect this team to get back to the NCAA tournament. And I really don't think that anything less than a win or even 2 wins in the tournament is going to be seen as a successful season because of just the amount of investments that you've made to really overhaul this roster. What Danny Sprinkle said he needs to see from his group this year, I think we're going to see a big step forward in year 2.
Roman, thank you so much for jumping on, folks. You want to hear more about this team? You want to hear more about the basketball team, the football team, everything going on in Seattle? Check out Locked On Huskies. Great stuff. Thanks again for hopping on.
Thanks for having me.